No, because Nixon was allying with China at that time. That was the whole point.
Why did the elite sabotage Nixon? Because that's clear and admitted now that Haig and Kissinger and others did that. Why did the establishment turn on Nixon?
I think there were two things. One is that they sincerely wanted at that point to liquidate the Vietnam War and focus on other things that were coming up. But there's also the question of weakening the presidency. With Nixon, it sounds bombastic and theatrical in retrospect, but there were these aspects of an imperial presidency, right? Nixon wanted to be an authoritarian. He wanted to have a strong presidency, and this was exactly what the oligarchy didn't want. Think of it. The Washington Post is really the house organ of the Federal Reserve System. The Washington Post was founded by Eugene Meyer, who was a refugee from the Federal Reserve. He hated Roosevelt. He disagreed with Roosevelt's economic policies, and he set the Washington Post up as the paper that he bought in the Capitol here to be an anti-Roosevelt and then later anti-presidential, anti-government in that sense organ. So the Washington Post always stands for a weak presidency and ultimately for a strong Federal Reserve. So I think the idea was permanently weaken the president with the Watergate coup, and they succeeded because they look at the people after that. Ford, Carter, really very, very weak presidents.
All right, stay there. Let's get into Iran and the war clouds, storm clouds forming on that front, the economy, and false flag terror. Straight ahead with Webster Tarpley. I'm Alex Jones.
Crashing through the lies and disinformation. It's Alex Jones on the GCN Radio Network.
You have found it, the front lines of the info war, the tip of the spear. We're here 6 days a week, Sundays 4 to 6 p.m. Central, and of course kicking off weekdays at 11 a.m. Central. Here's the headline from 2 weeks ago, and I keep making a big deal out of this because it's so important. Top Clinton official, only a terror attack can save Obama. They told the Bilderberg Group House organ, the Financial Times of London, even more elitist than the Washington Post. He said the bottom line here is that Americans don't believe in President Obama's leadership, said Shapiro, adding, quote, he has to find some way between now and November of demonstrating that he is a leader who can command confidence, and short of a new 9/11 event or an Oklahoma City bombing, I can't think of how he can do that. Now, I want to get into Iran, but I want to put it in the context of where you see the Anglo-American establishment. Every time I say that, I get emails saying, don't bash white people. It has nothing to do with white people. It means the U.S., British, Dutch power arm. That's what they call it themselves, the heart of the global banking cartel. At a key point of announcing world government, global carbon taxes, Malthusian initiatives, the world is now awakening to them. I would, from my basic forecast, say that they're in deep trouble. They admit they're in deep trouble. They're panicking. They're saying they want to shut down freedom on the web because we are devastating them. So, Webster, in context, Iran, as a false flag event itself, using a Strait of Hormuz event to launch that, how does that tie into other false flags? Looking into your historical crystal ball, what is the state of the geopolitical jockeying right now?
Well, let me start with the desperation of the Anglo-American ruling class. In other words, the bankers of the City of London and the bankers of Wall Street, along with some of these other places that you've mentioned. They are desperate because we have a world economic depression, right? We have this massive $1.5 quadrillion of toxic kited derivatives which are insolvent, can't be paid. And these are the forces of depression. Now, the main project that the London, New York people had in the past 8, 10, 12 months was to try to unload those forces of depression against Europe. And this was the big hedge fund attack on Greece, Spain, Portugal. It was a concerted, conspiratorial event, right, written up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal with various hedge funds, including Soros, including SAC, including Einhorn of Greenlight Capital, including Paulson and Company, and others. And the idea was you could get a crisis going against the euro. And I think the goal of that was to have a panic flight, an actual collapse of the euro, where we would lose 1/3 or 1/2 or maybe more of its value in just a few days, to have that in May sometime. The big lesson is that it has not worked. So far, the euro is holding relatively steady. The Europeans have done this phony bank stress test. The Europeans now think that they can survive, and that leaves these forces of depression are going to go somewhere, and they can go towards London. They could go towards Tokyo, I suppose, or they could go towards China. I don't think that's very likely. The likely targets are, once again, London and New York. And if it goes towards London, remember there's that euro-dollar market sitting in London. So if London goes down, the dollar begins to go down very rapidly.
And we've already seen that starting, but let me stop you for a moment. From your research, what are the power fissures? Because to have Merkel come out 3 months ago, during the start of this, and say criminal banks are doing this by design, and to have these big brokerage firms admit they were doing it, Europe supposedly allied with this whole New World Order. So this does look like desperation, that the vampires are now trying to feed on their own brethren, vampires.
Yes, well, of course, they always do that, right? It's always beggar my neighbor, export the depression to the next guy, and if you can hang on longer, you can feast on his flesh. And the big thing that the Germans did was the banning of the naked credit default swaps and the banning of many kinds of naked sales of short sales of stock. But now, if you can't save the dollar from a crash in the next 6 to 12 months, say, by dumping all of that into Europe and then essentially, having a distressed merchandise sale in Europe and using that loot to prop up the dollar, what can you do? Well, this gets us back to 1973 and the oil crisis of that year, which was planned at the Bilderberger meeting in Saltsjöbaden, Sweden, where they had presentations about the effect of a 400% rise in the price of oil. And that gave rise to Henry Kissinger's Kippur War of October 1973 and a completely phony Arab oil boycott, which never interrupted supplies, but was used as a kind of a stunt, a public relations event to allow the brokers to bid up the spot prices in the various commodity markets for oil around the world. If you had an attack on Iran today, the response of the Iranians would be some kind of attempted interdiction of the Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, and things like this. And ironically, this would be exactly what the doctor ordered for the dollar, because if you raise the price of oil from the current 75 or 80 or whatever it is, if you can get that up to 500 or 1,000, you create a tremendous demand for dollars. There would be no dollar crisis for some time to come if you could get the price of oil up at that level. And you can also see all of these wonderful Malthusian green jobs programs, right? All the wind energy, the windmills and the solar cells and the electric cars, things that are not economical today, that require government subsidies, would become economical. They would become economically feasible in a general context of complete immiseration.
So that would force the acceptance of the carbon tax.
Well, at that point, you wouldn't even need a carbon tax because you'd be bringing it in through the price. In other words, all of the people who want the carbon tax are trying to raise the price of energy because they hate energy. They hate energy production. They hate industry. They hate technology, science, progress.
And by the way, they say this. They want a post-industrial world because it's a finance system against true productivity and their entire Malthusian system. So it appears the only move they've got is A, attacking Iran and other nations, and B, staging domestic operations to try to stymie the populist movement that is voting out incumbents across the political spectrum.
Yes, and above all, this idea of raising the price of oil, which would for them be a godsend. Now, there are a couple of other things that are going on. The neocons were kicked out, by and large, from the Bush-Cheney regime during 2007. And the landmark on that was that National Intelligence estimate of December 2007, which said Iran has no nuclear weapons program. They said that with high confidence. Now, that meant that Cheney, essentially, his goose was cooked. That was his last gasp, really, of getting the war going with Iran. Now, there's an attempt to come back and change that finding with a new national intelligence estimate, which will, of course, now say, we think that Iran does have a nuclear weapons program. All kinds of signals on that coming from Mrs. Clinton, from Panetta, from Gates. The U.S. has actually been telling the other Perm 5 members at the United Nations that this will be coming very soon. And they even say they won't publish the NIE itself, but they'll publish the findings, which will simply be Believe us, trust us, Iran has a nuclear weapons program. Behind this, in turn, the Brzezinski group, in kicking out the neocons, had promised that they could take over Iran with the color revolution,
but
the
they
green
failed.
revolution of Mousavi. And it's failed now. This has not gone anywhere. So that doesn't work. You've also got the idea that Russian policy has become less stern, less formidable, let's say. We now have this sort of dual power situation of Putin and Medvedev. Now, Putin was, of course, a very tough customer, and even though it was very unlikely that Russia would risk war for the sake of Iran,